think about January 20th and Donald Trump becoming president of the United States again, which emotions do you personally feel?
What emotions? Welcome, Donald.
A bit of lighthearted humor did little to dispel the palpable gravity of the situation. Speaking at a press conference at the EU summit in Brussels this past December, Ukraine's President Zelensky continued the diplomatic balancing act he had been perfecting for months: how to navigate the evolving security dynamics in light of the incoming Trump administration without jeopardizing Ukraine's future.
What can I say? So for us, it's very important that I think that President Trump is a strong man, and I want very much to have him on our side.
One of the things that's so surprising in retrospect is how much the summit was in many ways overshadowed in the news cycle by electoral politics in the United States.
The challenges that we're facing today are simply too great for any ally to face alone. That's why cementing the transatlantic bond as we move forward is not a nice to have, but a must, especially in this day and age.
While Russian gray zone or hybrid attacks against NATO are nothing new in and of itself, I would say over the last 2 years or 18 months, we have seen that these have become much more kinetic and much more, frankly, in your face. Increasingly seems like Russia doesn't even care if it gets caught or if there's a direct Russian fingerprint on these attacks.
We can simply not underestimate the importance of Ukraine's security on our own security. And we must help Ukraine to be in the best possible position to start peace talks when it decides to do so from a position of strength.
Frankly, NATO should be prepared for anything and everything. It doesn't seem like President-elect Trump has changed his view of NATO as a golf club where members pay dues.
For better or worse, the approach that the American government takes towards Ukraine is going to shape nearly everything about the conversation at NATO and the room for maneuver that the alliance has with respect to Ukraine.
In this episode, we look back at a defining year in NATO history, and we also look ahead to the challenges and also the opportunities positioned to shape the alliance in the coming years and decades. Where does NATO go from here? What are the alliance's priorities and challenges over the next decade? And can NATO survive another Donald Trump presidency? In this series, we are going on a deep dive into why NATO, 75 years in, remains an integral security guarantor for the United States, for Europe, and for those still waiting for membership. Throughout this series, we'll be hearing from people who have dedicated their careers to serving, understanding, and educating about NATO's mission, its work, and its role in preserving transatlantic security. I'm Natalia Gopitnik, Director of Communications at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
I'm Rick Landgraf, Senior Fellow in the Institute's Eurasia program, and this is The Ties That Bind.
NATO at 75 and beyond. Thanks for joining us.
My guest today is Susan Colbourn. Susie is a historian of post-1945 international affairs at Duke University, where she is the Associate Director of the Program in American Grand Strategy and Associate Research Professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy. She is the author of Euromissiles, The Nuclear Weapons That Nearly Destroyed NATO, published by Cornell University Press in 2022. Susie specializes in European security and NATO with, as you have said, a healthy dash of Canadian content. Susie, welcome to The Ties That Bind. It's great to have you here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here.
Well, there's much to talk about with regard to NATO over the past 6 months. Let's start with a bit of a recap. The 32 allies, the heads of state of the 32 allies met in Washington for the 75th anniversary summit back in July. What major decisions and announcements were made at the summit?
Yeah, it's hard to believe that was almost 6 months ago. It feels like a lot has happened in those months. But looking back to the summit in July, the core decisions or announcements were really a package related to Ukraine. And so I'm thinking in particular of the NATO security assistance and training for Ukraine, a mechanism to coordinate military equipment and training for Ukraine from NATO allies and partners. It is something that in the announcement and the final declaration released from the summit, that the allies were careful to describe as consistent with Ukraine's self-defense, as outlined in the Charter of the United Nations, and an initiative that would not make NATO party to the war in Ukraine. But they did cast it as an initiative that would advance Ukraine's integration with the alliance. And then alongside that security and assistance and training mechanism, they also announced a pledge of long-term security assistance for Ukraine, right? So to provide a minimum of 40 billion euros within the year. So really trying to show a degree of ongoing support for Ukraine's war effort.
Now, regarding Ukraine's integration into NATO as a full member, what did the allies say about that?
Yeah, so at the summit, right, they treated Ukraine as the centerpiece of the summit in a lot of respects. And so the declaration affirmed the basic rights of Ukraine to determine its security arrangements and shape its own future. Nothing new in terms of allied language. And they affirmed once more that that future is with Ukraine as a member of NATO. Now, the path to that membership, the declaration used this phrase or this architectural metaphor of a bridge. But, and I think it's worth, right, noting that securing that kind of statement is significant given the unwieldy consensus-based group of 32 individual states that NATO now is. But the specifics of that bridge metaphor are still fairly fuzzy, right? So if we torture the metaphor, right, you might wonder how long is the span of that bridge, right? And what happens to Ukraine and its security as it moves along the bridge from one side to the other. So still some pretty big open questions, it seems to me, about Ukraine and its future within the alliance.
Now, Ukraine was a centerpiece of that summit, but also summit language and meetings had to do, obviously, with Russia's war in Ukraine and also China's growing partnership with Russia. What did the allies say about both Russia's aggressiveness and also Chinese support to Russia?
Yeah, so I think that some of the summit language was fairly telling and fairly straightforward, very clear in allied perceptions of both the threat posed by Russia and then the degree to which China is a source of concern. Right, so the summit declaration described Russia as the most significant and direct threat to the security of the alliance's members, and then, as you say, Rick, right, made explicit reference to the strategic partnership emerging and solidifying between Russia and China. And so China itself, the allies cast as a challenge, both as a result of the policies the People's Republic of China is pursuing, but also its overall ambitions, which they describe as a threat or a challenge to the alliance on a number of fronts. Interests, security, and values are the three core buckets they referred to. And so in talking about the threats posed by Russia, you can see a variety of different areas of concern. So, of course, Russia's aggressive behavior, its aggressive war in Ukraine is a focal point in the document, but also talk, of course, of hybrid threats, of the sort of plurality of ways that Russia can threaten the alliance. And I think there's one other piece that's worth mentioning. So not only do you have explicit reference to Russia and China, but the summit declaration also name checks Iran as a destabilizing factor in the Euro-Atlantic. So you can see some really interesting conversations happening in allied circles about how actors outside the Euro-Atlantic are shaping the regional security of the treaty area.
Right. The summit language and the focus really hints at this idea of growing partnership and growing association, not only between Russia and China, but also Iran and North Korea. Did anything surprise you that came out of this summit?
These summits are always a little bit of unusual occasions because they're not designed for surprises, right? They're designed to be a showcase of the alliance, of its strength. I mean, effectively, the Washington summit was a 75th birthday party. And so those require a bunch of advanced planning and stage management to try and produce an event fit for the occasion. But I think in the context of us talking about this in early December, one of the things that's so surprising in retrospect is how much the summit was in many ways overshadowed in the news cycle by electoral politics in the United States. Right. So if we think back to July, President Biden's opening speech at the summit was really part of a concerted effort at damage control, right? Trying to put his reelection bid back on the rails after his June 27th debate with former and what we now know to be soon to be current President Trump, which really feels in many ways like a lifetime ago.
Right. Such a good point.
And so it's a good reminder of just how much immediate context can shape these summits and the way they're perceived and how they the coverage immediately surrounding them, but that sometimes those flashy things in and around the summit fade very quickly. I mean, we're obviously not so concerned about President Biden's reelection bid these days, and so that is just a striking thing to me about how quickly the conversation changes.
For an insider's perspective on the mood within the alliance, Rick spoke with Nina Soljan, the head of NATO affairs and security policy at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and a career diplomat from the Republic of Croatia.
We're speaking here in January, right after the new year. Donald Trump has been reelected to become the president of the United States. He will be inaugurated in a few weeks' time here. Obviously, Donald Trump has had quite a history with NATO from his first term, being really an outspoken critic of the alliance and what he perceives as unfair treatment of the United States by European allies, not spending enough on defense spending. What is the mood like in the corridors of NATO now, with Trump returning to the White House over the next few weeks?
Well, Rick, as you said, it's important to remember that Donald Trump is not new to NATO. During his first presidency, he strongly advocated increased defense spending, and that actually yielded significant results, with now 23 out of the 32 allies spending the minimum guideline of 2% on defense. And also all allies agreeing that the level of spending needs to be increased to make sure we're ready to keep the alliance safe in the future. Further, during his first term as president, Donald Trump and his administration incentivized allies to turn their attention in a systematic way to the challenges coming from China. It's now clear that China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine, and that we really must be clear-eyed about the impact of China's coercive policies on our security. Secretary General Rutte met with the incoming president already in November, and he said that he's looking forward to working with the president-elect and his team. Now, we're all aware that there is uneasiness in Europe over Trump's impact on the alliance, given some of the comments that we've heard. But I don't think it's productive to speculate how the Trump administration will approach key issues once in office. They will also need a bit of time to clearly define their priorities and course of action.
To learn more about what to expect for U.S.-NATO relations in 2025 and beyond, Rick spoke with Sara Moller, an associate professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at both the Center for New American Security and the Atlantic Council.
A lot has been made about how NATO has tried to Trump-proof the alliance, going back to earlier this summer at the Washington summit, and even before that. Now, this Trump-proofing is now a reality because Trump has been reelected and will become the president next year in January. So to review, can you tell us a bit about how NATO has tried to, quote-unquote, Trump-proof the alliance?
Sure. Let me just say first that I've always been a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the idea that you can Trump-proof NATO, which is a U.S.-led alliance. because to my mind, that would require downgrading the role or the power of the US inside NATO's integrated military command. And as long as America remains the supreme guarantor of Europe's security and defense, the US president, whoever that is, whoever he or she may be, will always exert greater influence within the alliance than the other allies. That's just a fact. But having said all of that, we did see signs that allied officials, with the support of the Biden administration, were trying to prepare for this eventuality, the reelection of Donald Trump, over the course of the late summer and into the fall. And I think where you saw this the clearest was probably in efforts to so-called NATO-fy or NATO-ize support for Ukraine. So, for example, this past summer, on the heels of the 75th anniversary summit in Washington, NATO leaders announced a new command, the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine Command, or NSATU for short. It's headquartered in Wiesbaden, Germany, and it's supposed to oversee training of Ukrainian armed forces in allied countries and provide support for long-term development of Ukraine's armed forces, as well as coordinate the transfer of security assistance materiel to Ukraine and the repair of some equipment. Now, the interesting thing to note is that when it was announced this past July, NATO said they anticipated the office would eventually grow to have some 700 staff members or personnel, and it is supposed to be fully operational by the end of this year, so later this month. But even though it is an effort to institutionalize support for Ukraine inside the NATO architecture, a significant number of those 700 billets, at least initially, were being held by US personnel. And while it's hard to get accurate data on this point, there's enough to suggest that a non trivial number of those 700 positions will still be staffed by Americans. So, for example, Finland recently announced it was contributing 6 people to the mission. 6, not 60, in case listeners missed that the first time around. And Croatia has been embroiled in a political debate all autumn because its populist president is opposed to supporting the mission at all. So there are some political elements within the alliance who worry that this new NATO command could lead to NATO directly becoming involved in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, independent of what Trump may or may not do.
No, that's interesting. The 700 billets, it sounds like a huge command, and it seems that the U.S. would have a large share of that, or sizable chunk of that. And as you mentioned, a smaller country with a smaller military, Finland has 6. But is this a command where, in theory, all 32 allies would staff this command?
Well, Hungary negotiated an opt-out under Secretary General Stoltenberg over the summer because Hungary was opposed to the creation of this command. And what we're seeing in Croatia is an open political debate about whether that country will provide any troops. That, coupled with some of the smaller contributions from other NATO allies, again leads me to the conclusion that even this effort, which was intended to NATO-ize support for Ukraine, will end up, at the end of the day, being very much a US-led initiative inside of NATO.
NATO has gone to great trouble to avoid being seen as directly involved in the Ukraine war. However, it is involved in coordinating military assistance to Ukraine, and individual member states, such as the United States, but many others, are providing support in a number of ways, including the direct transfer of weapons, training Ukrainian soldiers, targeting, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support. So, Sara, I ask you, what then constitutes direct involvement in the Ukraine war?
Mm-hmm. It's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right that NATO has been at pains not to become directly involved in the Ukraine war and has repeatedly stressed it is not directly involved in the Ukraine war. But there's a reason for that. Remember, NATO is a defensive alliance, and as such, it has responsibility to all 32 of its members, and Ukraine is not yet a member. So NATO has a responsibility to its 32 members to ensure it does not undertake actions of an offensive military nature. And my own view is that NATO was very careful early on in the conflict to steer clear of that risk. But the creation of NSATU risks moving the needle closer to the direct involvement end of the spectrum, if you will. So, yes, as you note, NATO allies acting in their national capacity have provided Ukrainian armed forces with military assistance and high caliber weapons, the latest being the ATACMS and other things like ISR. But the key here is that this is all played out until now outside of what I like to call big NATO, the alliance's institutional architecture. And under NSATU, it's expected that NATO will deploy personnel to Western Ukraine to advise Ukrainian armed forces in country, no longer just out of country. And to my mind, that comes with risks. What do you do if or when there's a strike that kills NATO personnel? Allies have said they won't treat that as an attack on them, and therefore Article 5 is off the table. So countries like France, who plan to send their personnel to Ukraine for training, have signaled they understand and will accept that risk to their national. But there's the ideal in theory, and then there's what happens in practice. And war seldom adheres to theory. So I worry a lot about that. What if there's a Russian strike that kills a dozen NATO personnel and NATO does nothing? What signal then does that send to Moscow if the NAC deliberates and decides not to respond? Or if NATO decides to respond and retaliate militarily, well, then we're in an entirely different world. And frankly, I'd like to avoid seeing the NAC and NATO being put in a position of having to decide how to respond to such an eventuality. So back to your question, what constitutes direct support by NATO as opposed to simply stuff individual allies are doing either in their national capacity or in groups with other allies? To my mind, that would be things like Allied aircraft enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, right? This was something that was floated by the media early on in the war. But even though that would involve national assets, national aircraft, a no fly mission would automatically entail the involvement of NATO's Allied Air Command, which is the headquarters responsible for air operations in Europe. So there would be a degree of direction, in other words, coming from a NATO entity. And that would, to my mind, constitute direct support. Another example would be what is likely to happen in the coming months, deploying NSATU personnel to the front line. So if you define the front today as pretty much anything east of the line running from Kharkiv to Dnipro, but even then, I'm pretty risk averse by nature, so I would prefer not to see, frankly, any NATO personnel east of Kiev, if I'm honest. Having them so close to the fighting could be construed as direct involvement because the advisors would then be supporting frontline troops in their combat operations targeting Russian forces, as opposed to providing advice and training to them in Western Ukraine, in the rear in places like Lviv, which is some 1,000 kilometers from the front. So I think the real way to approach this question would be to employ the counterfactual. If the situation was reversed and Russia was providing military support in a conflict which the US was engaged in, what would we consider direct involvement? So during the Korean War, for example, Russian pilots flew MiGs, but Washington kept this quiet and out of the newspapers at the time because officials rightly worried that the conflict could escalate from a proxy war into a direct confrontation between the two. And this signals to me that this is not a new concern, obviously, but I do think it is something that the alliance has to think carefully about going forward. And that's how I tend to look at this.
No, thank you so much. That's great, great insight there. And it seems like NATO is certainly involved in a slippery slope, and to a certain extent, it seems that direct support or direct involvement is in many ways in the eye of the beholder.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you about, as we turn the page from 2024 to 2025, and President Trump comes back to the White House in January, a lot has been made about what a Trump 2.0 presidency will look like for NATO and how the United States' role within the alliance may evolve under Trump moving forward. What are a few different scenarios that you can foresee happening?
I'm a firm believer, Rick, in the axiom fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. So I learned long ago not to make any predictions when Donald Trump is concerned, because, and frankly, I'm innately skeptical of anyone who claims to have insight in this regard because he flies by the seat of his pants. He
Right.
is an extremely volatile leader. He's known to change his mind based on whoever he spoke to last. He also loves to rile folks up and be provocative and make outlandish statements and then sit back and watch the fallout. We know he's trumped Keith Kellogg, who is a retired lieutenant general and served on his NSC staff during his first term, to be the Russia Ukraine envoy. And there's a proposal floating around town and in Europe for ending the war, which would include delaying Ukrainian entry into NATO for a decade. We also know he's picked for his ambassador or perm rep to NATO, Matt Whitaker, who's a relatively unknown entity. But beyond that, I think it's worth keeping in mind that judging by his first term, folks who serve in the Trump administration tend to have a very short shelf life.
Right.
And I expect the same pattern to continue here with lots of turnover in the national security portfolio. So I think, frankly, NATO should be prepared for anything and everything. But at a minimum, I expect we'll see a lot more chaos and inflammatory rhetoric, than we saw, obviously, during the Biden tenure. And judging by his interview with NBC's Meet the Press this past weekend, it doesn't seem like President-elect Trump has changed his view of NATO as a golf club where members pay dues. In other words, he still has this very transactional approach to America's allies. And so I don't expect we'll see much change there from the first term. Now, if he chooses to attend next year's summit in The Hague, which at this moment is an open question, right? I'm sure we'll see some fireworks there, as was the case during any summit during his first term. But beyond that general overview, I'm frankly not comfortable predicting because he is such an unpredictable character.
Nina, in your view, what are NATO's biggest priorities and challenges in 2025 and over the next decade?
Well, I'd say that our biggest priorities for 2025 are the following, probably the three top priorities. First, further boosting defense spending across Europe and Canada. While significant progress has been made, we're still spending far less than we were during the Cold War. And it's clear that even more will be needed to preserve peace and prosperity across North America and Europe. Second, I'd say is ramping up defense industry. We have robust defense plans in place, and we know what assets and capabilities we need. Accelerating the growth of defense industrial capacity and production across the alliance and prioritizing a truly transatlantic industry. This is something that the Secretary General is working very hard on. And third, continuing to support Ukraine militarily and politically. This support is as essential and as urgent as ever. We can simply not underestimate the importance of Ukraine's security on our own security. And we must help Ukraine to be in the best possible position to start peace talks when it decides to do so from a position of strength. So, looking ahead, it's always difficult to predict what the future holds. The current security environment is extremely volatile and is rapidly changing. But the reason why NATO is the most successful alliance in history is exactly because of its ability to adapt. So I expect that the organization will adapt to be able to deal with whatever threats and challenges it will face in the next decade. That said, we can still identify some trends that are likely to continue for some time. The three top priorities that I mentioned for this year: defense spending, defense industry, and Ukraine, eventually post-war, will remain on top of the agenda for some time. And these will inevitably be discussed in the context of European responsibility and capacity to do more to contribute to collective defense.
Obviously, NATO has had a lot of internal challenges and tensions over the years. The current debate over defense spending and burden sharing is certainly not new. It's dated back all the way back to the Eisenhower administration. Back in 2014, as you know and as our listeners know, the Allies agreed to a defense investment of 2% of GDP back at the Wales Summit. The Allies also announced here in Washington just in July that 2/3 of the Allies now hit that 2% target. But there's also at the same time about moving beyond that 2% target and whether or not that is enough and whether or not focusing on inputs is really the best focus to measure burden sharing. Is this 2% sustainable, and is it enough at this time in your view?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the biggest challenges right now is figuring out how to calibrate the defense spending conversation and what metrics should frame it. So, as you say, the 2% target is hardly a new one, right? The commitment comes from 2014, but even that 2014 commitment was an upgrade of earlier guidelines for 2% spending that was made in 2006. And so a lot, right, a lot has changed in the geopolitical landscape since 2014 or 2006. And there are a number of trends facing the alliance that I think reasonably suggest that 2% is not enough. And we can see that reflected in a lot of current conversation about how 2% should be the floor, not the ceiling, given the security threats in the Euro-Atlantic. But this question of how sustainable it is, I mean, I would point to the fact that even after 10 years, there are still, if 2/3 of the allies have reached that 2% commitment, that still means there is a third of them who have not reached that 2% commitment, even after 10 years. And so that does make it difficult if we start to think about moving the conversation towards one where the allies consider an increased spending target, right? There's been talk of 2.5%, 3% as possible new targets. And I think as you indicate in the question you asked, right, all of this talk about percentage points actually sidesteps a bigger question, which is whether or not a percentage target actually is measuring the thing that is most valuable to the alliance, right? It's a crude proxy to evaluate contribution, but it's not necessarily one that's calibrated to addressing the actual defense requirements that should, in the Allies' estimation, be driving spending. And meeting the spending target doesn't necessarily guarantee that the country meeting the target actually has a military that meets most reasonable expectations of readiness. And if you think about the alliance's history, this has long been a source of debate and contest. I mean, the idea of spending targets was a product of the late 1970s. And this argument appears in those debates, right? About whether or not quantity matters or quality of contribution matters. And we're seeing another round of that debate right now. So even as policymakers in the Baltic states, for instance, are lobbying for maybe reopening the conversation about spending targets, they've also pointed to the obvious, which is that investing in a lot of the equipment needed. So if you invest in things like air defense systems or long-range strike capabilities, that's probably going to require spending well over 2.5 or 3%.
Right. Sara, from your perspective, what other sort of challenges does NATO face over the next decade? What are the biggest sort of obstacles?
I think, broadly speaking, NATO and the world in general are entering a period of great uncertainty and instability. We're already in it, I think it's fair to say. And that is bound to have consequences for NATO because it will have to learn to navigate this increasingly volatile era of geopolitical competition and regional and global instability. And whether it's the volatility that we're witnessing this week in the Mediterranean with the collapse of the Syrian regime, which is obviously a good outcome, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what comes next, whether it's the war in Gaza or Lebanon, whether it's the war in Sudan. It's clear to even the most casual observer by now that we are living in unstable times. And at the same time, Russia isn't going anywhere, as I mentioned earlier, and has stepped up its kinetic attacks against the alliance. And that presents NATO with a lot of challenges on its borders, on its periphery. And there are also internal challenges to the alliance itself, democratic backsliding within the alliance. We spoke about Hungary and Turkey, Romania, Croatia, and others, to include maybe even the United States. What Frank Fukuyama almost 2 decades ago referred to as the rise of illiberal democracies. I think it's worth remembering here that NATO is also a political alliance. When new members sign the Washington Treaty, the alliance's founding document, they commit themselves not only to safeguard each other's freedom, but also to maintain the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And I think it's fair to say that these are increasingly under attack around the world, but also within the alliance itself. And increasingly, I worry that this may end up proving to be NATO's biggest challenge in the coming years.
I think for me, one of the biggest challenges that the alliance will face is that for all it is this large, significant bureaucracy with various committees and so many people staffing it, it is built on a foundation that is ultimately about what we might informally call the fuzzy stuff, right? It is an institution based on a desire to inspire confidence. It's one of its core mechanisms and contributions in international security is a psychological one, that there is strength in numbers, that someone will have your back if you are under attack, that strength in numbers can change the psychology of adversaries, right? That was true in the late 1940s in the founding conversations. That I think is still true in 2024 or early 2025. And the potential that Donald Trump, particularly as an individual, can severely rattle that confidence, maybe in ways that are cause long-term damage or are irreversible, I think is the single biggest unknown, right? We know that he is happy to speculate about whether or not the United States would come to the defense of other signatories in the pact, right? Has done so on a number of occasions, both as president and as a candidate. And all of those chip away at the sort of psychological underpinnings of the alliance and are very hard to guard against, right? We can see that Congress, right, passed legislation requiring Senate approval to withdraw from the North Atlantic Treaty, but that doesn't mean that the president can't hollow out the meaning or value or confidence in Article 5 in many other ways.
Russia is preparing for a long-term confrontation with us. Its defense industry is scaling up with the help of China, Iran, and North Korea. These are different countries, and many of their objectives may be different, but together they're aiming to destabilize the global order, weaken Europe and North America, and undermine our freedoms. Ensuring the alliance's cohesion when confronting these systemic competitors and potential adversaries will really be critical. Then there is an ongoing campaign of hostile actions against NATO allies, including cyber attacks, including sabotage, interfering with critical infrastructure, and disinformation. And these coercive and malicious activities are not going to disappear. On the contrary, they will most likely grow in both quantity and quality. And we have to make sure that we are well equipped across the alliance to protect vulnerabilities and to ensure resilience. Another thing that I'd like to mention is that we need to boost the alliance's ability to conduct operations across all domains on land, in the air, at sea, cyberspace, space as a single force. Considering the speed of information, data flows, and adversarial capabilities, further developing these operational capabilities that can be deployed across multiple domains will be crucial. Yet another priority, I'd say, will be working with others. The EU is an obvious partner, and we've already accomplished a lot together. Hopefully, we'll be able to overcome any structural barriers for cooperation so that we can actually achieve real synergies and efficiencies. But also, very importantly, we have developed close relationships with our partners in the Indo Pacific, with Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. NATO is a regional organization, but security is not regional. Security is global, as evidenced, for example, by North Korean troops fighting in Russia's war against Ukraine. In the future, we may be even more affected by events and developments not originating in the Euro Atlantic area. And we'll see to what extent the Euro Atlantic and the Indo Pacific theaters can be handled separately. That will be a challenge. And finally, continuous effort for us will be to change the perception of NATO in many parts of the world. Very often, NATO is associated with war and conflict, but in fact, NATO is a defensive alliance. It has helped allies deter aggression and preserve peace for 75 years. It's important that we keep sending this message to our own publics, but also to those in other countries. Rick?
Sara, I wanted to turn to a commentary you provided earlier this year that appeared in Survival, an issue of Survival, which is the journal of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And I believe this issue was released right around the time of the Washington summit back in July. And you argued that as NATO leaders gather in Washington to celebrate the 75th anniversary, the organization continues to grapple with difficult questions regarding how to effectively respond to Russian aggression in Europe. And to find a way forward, the Allies must first confront the growing strategic mismatch between NATO military plans, public messaging, and national capabilities. If European officials cannot convince their constituents that Russia is a chronic threat, they will face ongoing difficulties in implementing the defense upgrades needed to deter Russia. How has your thinking evolved on this subject from summertime up until now, NATO's anniversary predicament?
Right. If anything, I'm even more concerned in this regard that the public rhetoric about the Russian threat is not being matched behind the scenes, not just in terms of defense investments, but also emphasis on personnel commitments, right? As part of the NATO reforms, defense posture reforms, there are demands for, frankly, many more billets than the NATO allies have shown willingness to fill, right? And that's true not just of the NSATU command, but across the alliance as it's going about reworking, retooling its command structure. So I would say that coupled with the continued intensity of Russian kinetic hybrid attacks against Europe leaves me with concern, frankly, because while Russian gray zone or hybrid attacks against NATO are nothing new in and of itself, I would say over the last 2 years or 18 months, we have seen that these have become much more kinetic and much more, frankly, in your face, where it increasingly seems like Russia doesn't even care if it gets caught or if there's a direct Russian hand
Sara.
or fingerprint on these attacks, whether it's striking undersea cables or attempted assassinations on industry leaders. It just seems like we've entered a new phase in this gray zone or hybrid conflict. And to date, I think NATO is still struggling with what to do about it. They know it's a challenge. Russia is unlikely to go anywhere soon. And in this respect, the alliance had been working towards a new Russia strategy, which was going to be the main deliverable at next year's summit in The Hague. And as part of that, I suspect hybrid activities, countering Russian hybrid activities in Europe would have been a major component of that new Russia strategy. But it's an open question to my mind whether we will see that now, given Trump's election. Right, the president could come in and say there's no need for this, and or his administration could try to water down the Russia strategy as part of some larger Russia-Ukraine deal, or another scenario you could envisage. So I remain equally, if not more, concerned about this.
Nina, as we close here, final question. We're speaking again. We've come to the end of the year, now embarking on a new one, 2025. The new year is typically a time for resolutions and optimism. Yet the narrative about NATO so often is that it is an alliance in crisis, constantly dealing with both internal and external challenges and issues. We've talked about a few of those today. As we embark on this new year and take a look forward, is there reason to be optimistic about NATO? Is there good news on the horizon?
Absolutely, Rick. There is a cause for optimism. I think we just have to look at NATO's history. We've been around for 75 years, and there's always, as you said, this sense that NATO is in crisis, a state of panic. NATO is not relevant anymore. NATO is brain dead. NATO is lost. But it has always risen to the occasion, and there is no reason to believe that going forward we'll be in a different situation. There will be challenges, but NATO is well equipped to deal with them.
This has been The Ties That Bind, NATO at 75 and Beyond, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Our guests were all incredibly generous with their time, so we do encourage you to hear all of their insights in the complete interviews and transcripts available in the link in the description of this episode. For more podcasts, analysis, and to learn about upcoming events, please visit us at fpri.org.